The story of Satan refusing to bow down to Adam in Surah 15 comes from the first century Jewish apocryphal work, The Life of Adam and Eve.
Okay, so the main problem here is David Wood's inconsistency and hypocrisy because, guess what? The New Testament, the book that David Wood allegedly abides or follows, quotes from the same Jewish or Old Testament pseudegraphical work. Paul quotes, or as David Wood would put it, plagiarizes a fable from the life of Adam and Eve, chapter 36, verse 4, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2. Paul also quotes from the life of Adam and Eve in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4. So, and again, I think the book of Hebrews chapter 1 also quotes from the life of Adam and Eve. And of course, the author of Hebrews is anonymous, according to Christian scholars. That means we don't know who the author is. But regardless, what the point I'm trying to make is that Paul, in the author of Hebrews, actually quotes or copies off of the life of Adam and Eve, the Old Testament pseudegraphical work, the life of Adam and Eve. So look at the hypocrisy and look at the inconsistency of David Wood. He's pointing the finger at the Quran when he doesn't realize that, the New Testament is plagiarizing or copying off that same book that he accuses the Quran of copying off of. So even Christian scholars admit this fact. Lee Martin McDonald, in his book, The Scriptures of Jesus, Jesus Research, New Methodologies and Perceptions, the second symposium on Jesus Research. So you get the reference you can see the reference on the screen there. Anyways, even Christian scholars admit that the author, or Paul, copied off of the Old Testament pseudegraphical work, The Life of Adam and Eve, and the Apocalypse of Moses, because the Apocalypse of Moses has that same story of angels worshiping Adam and Eve. It says that the pseudegraphical life of Adam and Eve and the Apocalypse of Moses also have several parallels in the writings of the New Testament. For example, see the following: compare the understanding of death and separation of soul and body in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 to 5, and the appearance of Satan and the brightness of an angel in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4. Apocalypse of Moses, chapter 17, verse 1, etc. So it looks like Paul, the author of 2 Corinthians, was copying or plagiarizing off the life of Adam and Eve, the Old Testament apocryphal or pseudegraphical work, The Life of Adam and Eve. So the question really arises: why did David Wood not mention this fact too in his book, in his video? Because if he's accusing the Quran of plagiarizing the life of Adam and Eve, then he needs to reread what the New Testament says, because according to Hebrews and according to 2 Corinthians, etc., they're copying or plagiarizing off the life of Adam and Eve too. So, what is the conclusion here? There's only one possible conclusion, and that is that the life of Adam and Eve is also used not only by the author of the Quran, but by Paul, the author of 2 Corinthians, etc., etc. So, David Wood is being hypocritical or inconsistent in his methodology. So what is the conclusion we can draw from this? The conclusion here is that David Wood is being inconsistent because the New Testament quotes from that same exact Old Testament pseudegraphical work, The Life of Adam and Eve. The Jews, before Jesus, or before the rise of Christianity, the Jews obviously had canonical books which were inspired, and they had historical books which were uninspired. So how do we explain the New Testament and the Quran copying or quoting off the life of Adam and Eve? We can explain this by the Jews obviously having canonical books and historical books. Historical books do have some historical truth in them, right? So again, not everything made it into the Bible. The Bible, both the Old Testament and New Testaments, quote from missing books of the Bible. Like, there's books like the book of the book of wars, the book of the wars of the Lord. That's found in the book of Numbers, but that's not in the Old Testament canon we have today. The book of Jasher is also mentioned in the Old Testament, but again, that's not in the canonical Old Testament that we have today. These books, these Old Testament pseudegraphical books do contain some truth in them because the New Testament quotes from them. So Christian scholars are forced to admit that truth is truth no matter where it's found. So both the New Testament and the Quran could be repeating true statements or stories found in the Old Testament book, The Life of Adam and Eve, because Christian scholars are forced to admit that there are true statements and stories in these Old Testament pseudegraphical works because the New Testament quotes off them. So if that defense works for the New Testament, why not the Quran?